1947, the United States Department of Agriculture published a quiet statistic that the food industry has spent 80 years pretending you never read. 40% of all the produce eaten in America that year was grown in backyard gardens, not factory farms, not commercial operations, backyards. Tomatoes from a quarter-acre lot in Cleveland, cabbages from a corner of a Pittsburgh tenement, potatoes from a Texas farmhouse plot the size of a parking space. Today, that number is under 1%. The same country, the same soil, the same sun. We did not lose the ability. We were sold a story that growing your own food was old-fashioned, inefficient, and beneath us. The companies that sold us that story now control the seeds, the fertilizers, the patents, and the price tags. Number 17 on this list was a winter growing technique your grandfather used. In a Wisconsin January, with nothing but a glass pane and a wooden box, modern greenhouses cost $10,000 and do the same job, worse. Number 8 is a seed-saving method, so simple, a child can do it, and so threatening to the seed industry that two of the biggest companies in the world have spent decades convincing you it does not work. And number 3 involves the contents of your kitchen trash bin and produces soil so rich that organic farms now pay $40 a cubic yard for what your grandfather got free. Big agriculture did not destroy these skills with regulation. It destroyed them with marketing. The same playbook that erased home medicine, home cooking, and home repair erased home growing. And the consequences are showing up now in food prices, soil collapse, and a population that cannot tell a tomato seed from a mustard seed. Hit subscribe, because what your grandfather knew about a square of dirt is going to feed your family long after the supply chain has stopped making promises it can keep. Let us count them down. Number 25. Saving seeds from open-pollinated tomatoes. Your grandfather pulled the ripest tomato from the vine, sliced it open at the kitchen table, and scooped the seed and gel mixture into a small mason jar with a splash of water. He set the jar on the windowsill and waited 3 days. By the 3rd day, the jar had grown a thin layer of white mold across the surface and smelled vaguely of fermentation. Most viewers would think the seeds had spoiled. Most viewers would be wrong. The fermentation broke down a chemical coating on each seed that prevents premature germination inside the fruit. He poured off the moldy water, rinsed the seeds clean in a fine sieve, spread them on a paper plate, and dried them by the wood stove for a week, stored in a paper envelope in a cool drawer. Those seeds stayed viable for 5 to 7 years. This works only with open-pollinated heirloom varieties. The hybrid F1 tomatoes most grocery stores sell have been bred specifically so that their seeds will not produce true offspring. That is not an accident. It is a business model. Seed companies invented hybrids precisely so you would have to buy new seeds every year for the rest of your life. A pack of heirloom tomato seeds costs $4 and contains roughly 30 seeds. The same pack, propagated correctly, produces enough seeds in one growing season to plant a small farm for the next decade. Number 24. The Three Sisters and other companion plantings. Long before European settlers arrived in North America, the Iroquois nations were planting corn, beans, and squash together in mounds. The corn provided a stalk for the beans to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, feeding the corn and squash. The squash spread broad leaves across the ground, shading out weeds and keeping moisture in the soil. 3 plants on the same square foot of ground, each one giving the other 2 something it could not produce alone. Your grandfather did not call it the Three Sisters. He called it not being a fool. He planted marigolds along the borders of his vegetable rows because their roots release thiophene, a compound that drives off root-knot nematodes. He planted basil between his tomatoes because the volatile oils confuse tomato hornworms. He planted nasturtiums near his squash to draw aphids away from the food crops. Modern agribusiness calls this polyculture and uses it as a marketing term. The farmer in 1942 called it Tuesday. Companion planting reduces pest damage by an average of 40 to 70% in controlled studies, eliminates the need for synthetic pesticides on most home crops, and increases total yield per square foot by 20 to 30% compared to monoculture. The chemistry is real. The benefit is real. The technique requires no equipment, no purchase, and no permission. Number 23. The compost heap as the foundation of everything. In one corner of every working garden of the early 20th century, there was a wooden three-sided enclosure, roughly 4 feet square. Into it went every kitchen scrap, every grass clipping, every fallen leaf, every coffee ground, every piece of cardboard, every weed pulled before it set seed. Out of it came the most valuable substance any gardener can produce: black, crumbly, sweet-smelling finished compost. The ratio, your grandfather knew, without measuring, was roughly 3 parts brown to 1 part green. Browns were dry leaves, straw, cardboard, sawdust. Greens were food scraps, fresh grass, manure, weeds, layered together with occasional turning and a soaking from the rain barrel. The pile heated up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit within a week and broke down into finished compost in 4 to 6 months. That heap solved 3 problems at once. It eliminated household organic waste. It produced free fertilizer worth hundreds of dollars in modern terms, and it built living, microbially active soil that no bag of synthetic fertilizer can replicate. A cubic yard of finished organic compost at a garden center sells for $40 to $60 in 2026. Your grandfather produced 2 cubic yards a year on his family kitchen output alone for the cost of building a wooden frame from scrap lumber. The math has not changed, only the willingness to learn it. Number 22. 4. Field crop rotation. No serious gardener of your grandfather's generation planted the same crop in the same bed 2 years running. He divided his garden into 4 sections and rotated through them on a 4-year cycle that he had memorized by the time he was 12. Year 1, the heavy feeders went in: tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, corn. Year 2, the light feeders: onions, garlic, root crops. Year 3, the soil builders: beans, peas, lentils, anything in the legume family that fixes atmospheric nitrogen back into the soil. Year 4, the brassicas and leaf crops: cabbage, kale, broccoli, lettuce. Then the cycle began again. The reason was not tradition. The reason was that crops in the same family draw the same nutrients and host the same pests. Plant tomatoes in the same bed for 3 years, and you will be fighting blight, rootworm, and exhausted soil all at once. Rotate them, and the bed regenerates itself between visits. Industrial agriculture has largely abandoned crop rotation in favor of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. That paper over the damage of monoculture. The result is the soil collapse that has reduced topsoil across the American Midwest by an average of 1 inch per decade for the last 60 years. Your grandfather farmed the same plot for 40 years, and the soil got better. Number 21. Soil as a living organism. First, pattern break. Here is what the synthetic fertilizer industry spent 50 years convincing American gardeners not to think about. A single tablespoon of healthy garden soil contains more living organisms than there are human beings on planet Earth. Bacteria, fungi, archaea, protozoa, nematodes, mites, springtails, and earthworms working together in a network of biological exchange so complex that modern soil scientists are still mapping its basic architecture. Your grandfather did not know the names. He knew that soil that smelled good grew good food. He knew that earthworm castings made his lettuce taste sweet. He knew that the white threads of fungus running through finished compost meant the pile was working. He knew that synthetic ammonia fertilizer killed the worms and turned the soil into something that grew vegetables only because it was being chemically force-fed. The agricultural chemical industry, beginning in the 1940s and accelerating through the 1960s, spent enormous sums convincing American farmers that traditional soil building was primitive and that science had moved past it. The science had not moved past it. The science had been redirected toward selling products. Today, soil scientists at major universities are publishing papers that read like translations of farming manuals from 1880. Your grandfather's compost heap was the cutting edge. We just stopped recognizing it. Number 20. Cover crops and green manure. When the last carrots and parsnips came out of the ground In October, your grandfather did not leave the garden bare for the winter. He scattered a handful of seed across the empty soil: winter rye, hairy vetch, crimson clover, buckwheat, depending on the bed and the season. By the time the first hard frost came, the soil was covered in a green carpet of cover crop. Those plants did three things over the winter. They prevented soil erosion from rain and snow. They captured atmospheric nitrogen and stored it in their root systems. And come spring, when he turned them under with a hoe 2 weeks before planting, they decomposed into instant fertilizer that fed the next season's crops. This is called green manure, and it has been practiced in some form for at least 3,000 years. The Romans wrote about it. Medieval European farmers depended on it. Your grandfather grew up with it as a normal part of the gardening calendar. It was free. It required no equipment beyond a broadcast spreader and a hoe, and it built soil instead of depleting it. Modern industrial agriculture leaves fields bare between commercial crops, then trucks in synthetic fertilizer to compensate for the soil it has degraded. A pound of cover crop seed at a feed store costs $3 and covers 100 square feet. The same protection from a synthetic fertilizer program costs roughly 15 times as much over a decade. Number 19. Mulching with leaves and hay. Every autumn, the trees of America drop millions of tons of dead leaves onto suburban lawns. And every autumn, millions of homeowners pay landscaping companies to vacuum those leaves into bags and haul them to landfills. Your grandfather watched this practice begin in the 1960s and shook his head every time he saw a truck hauling away what he called bagged gold. Dead leaves are one of the highest value soil amendments in nature. Spread 3 to 4 inches thick across a garden bed in autumn. Leaves do 5 things at once. They suppress weeds. They retain soil moisture through dry periods. They insulate roots from temperature swings. They feed the worm and microbe population beneath the surface, and they break down into rich black leaf mold over the course of a year, building topsoil where there was none. Hay works similarly when leaves are scarce. 3 bales of damaged or spoiled hay from a farm supply store cost about $30, and mulch a quarter-acre garden completely for a full year. Your grandfather paid less. He helped a neighbor stack a load of hay in exchange for the spoiled bales nobody wanted. The mulched garden requires a fraction of the watering, suffers a fraction of the weed pressure, and produces measurably better yields than the bare soil garden tilled and weeded by hand. The technique is older than recorded agriculture. The leaves are still falling every October. We just decided to throw them away. Number 18. The no-till garden. For most of the 20th century, conventional advice told American gardeners to turn their soil with a rototiller every spring. Your grandfather did this in his youth and stopped doing it sometime in his middle years after he noticed that his neighbor, who never tilled at all, was growing better tomatoes than he was. The reason is that tilling destroys the soil structure that healthy gardens depend on. Tilling chops up the network of mycorrhizal fungi that connect plant roots to nutrients deep in the subsoil. It disrupts the worm tunnels that aerate the bed. It exposes carefully built topsoil to wind and rain erosion, and it brings dormant weed seeds to the surface, where they germinate immediately, creating the very weed problem the tilling was supposed to solve. The no-till alternative is simple. Cover the existing bed with a layer of cardboard or several sheets of newspaper. Pile 6 inches of compost or aged manure on top. Cover that with 3 inches of straw or leaf mulch. Plant directly into the compost layer. The cardboard smothers existing weeds, breaks down within a season, and the bed gets richer with each passing year instead of poorer. Market gardeners using no-till methods on small plots are reporting yields per square foot that rival or exceed conventional farming on equivalent acreage. The technique requires no machinery, no fuel, and no annual replanting effort. Your grandfather called it lazy. Then he discovered it worked better. Number 17. Cold frames for winter growing. In a state like Wisconsin, where the ground freezes solid from December through March, your grandfather still ate fresh greens at his Christmas dinner table. The reason was a wooden box with a glass lid set against the south wall of the farmhouse, sunk halfway into the soil and lined with horse manure beneath the planting bed. This was a cold frame, and it was the original passive solar season extender. The glass top trapped solar heat during the day. The earth on 3 sides and the manure beneath provided thermal mass that held the heat through the night. Inside that box, in January, the temperature stayed above freezing, while the air outside was below zero. He grew spinach, mache, clatonia, kale, and winter lettuce in it from October through April. A cold frame can be built from scrap lumber and an old window sash for under $50. Modern greenhouse manufacturers sell heated structures that do roughly the same job for $10,000 and require electricity to maintain temperature. The cold frame requires nothing but sunlight and a few inches of decomposing manure. French market gardeners outside Paris fed the city year-round in the 1850s, using arrays of cold frames built across acres of urban land. Your grandfather fed his family through 3 Wisconsin winters with a single frame against the south wall. The technology has not improved. It has only been forgotten. Number 16. F1 hybrids and the Great Seed Switch. Second pattern break. Beginning in the 1930s and accelerating through the 1960s, the American seed industry quietly executed one of the most consequential business pivots in agricultural history. They stopped selling open-pollinated seeds to home gardeners and started selling hybrid seeds instead. The difference matters more than any other single fact in this entire script. An open-pollinated seed produces a plant whose own seeds, saved and replanted, will produce the same plant again. A hybrid F1 seed produces a plant whose seeds, if saved and replanted, will produce a wild and unpredictable mix of inferior offspring. Hybrids are deliberately bred to be sterile in the second generation. This was not a technological accident. It was a deliberate, strategic shift. The seed companies recognized that, as long as gardeners could save their own seeds, the seed companies were in a low-margin commodity business. By switching their flagship varieties to hybrids, they transformed seeds into an annually renewable subscription that every gardener had to pay for every spring. Today, 4 corporations control roughly 60% of the global commercial seed supply. The varieties they sell are overwhelmingly hybrids, and the open-pollinated heritage varieties that fed Americans for 200 years have largely vanished from commercial catalogs. Heirloom seed companies still exist, run by stubborn small operators in Iowa and Vermont and Maine. They are the last bridge to what your grandfather actually grew. The bridge is narrow, and it is not subsidized. Number 15. Hand-pollinating squash. Squash and pumpkins cross-pollinate aggressively. If you grow zucchini and butternut in the same garden and save seeds, the next generation will be a confused mongrel that resembles neither parent. Your grandfather solved this with a paintbrush and an alarm clock. The technique is precise. Squash flowers open at first light and close by mid-morning. The female flower is the one with a tiny squash already forming at its base. The male flower is the one on a long, bare stem. At dawn, before any bees arrived, your grandfather walked the squash patch with a small paintbrush, transferred pollen from the male flower of his chosen variety to the female flowers of the same variety, and then taped each pollinated female flower closed with a piece of masking tape so no bee could contaminate it later. 2 days later, he removed the tape. By autumn, those hand-pollinated fruits produced seeds that would grow true to type in his garden the following year, indefinitely, generation after generation, as long as he kept the technique alive. This is the only way to maintain a pure heirloom squash variety in a garden where multiple squash species are grown. It takes 10 minutes a morning for 2 weeks during peak flowering. It costs nothing, and it preserves a genetic line that your great-grandparents may have brought from the old country, and that no commercial seed company anywhere in the world will sell back to you. Number 14. Plating garlic and curing onions. Garlic and onions, properly cured, will store at room temperature for 9 to 12 months without refrigeration. Your grandfather did not refrigerate alliums. He cured them, plated them, and hung them from the cellar rafters. Curing began the day he pulled the garlic and onions from the ground in midsummer. He shook off the loose soil, did not wash them, and laid them on wire screens in a shaded, airy spot for 2 to 3 weeks. The papery outer skins dried and tightened around the bulbs. The neck, where the leaves met the bulb, sealed itself shut. Once cured, alliums become essentially inert until they are cut or split. Then came the plating. He braided the dry stalks together, 3 at a time, into long ropes of garlic or onion that hung against a cellar wall like ornaments. Each rope held 30 to 40 heads. A family with a half row of garlic had garlic for the entire next year, and the next, and the next, because each year he saved the largest cloves to replant in October for the next summer's harvest. A pound of garlic at the grocery store in 2026 costs around $5. A garden bed of 300 square feet produces 40 to 60 pounds of cured garlic per season. The math is so favorable to the gardener that grocery garlic only continues to sell because people have forgotten how to grow their own. Number 13, packing carrots in damp sand. Beyond drying and curing, your grandfather had a third preservation technique. For the harvest, the root cellar storage of fresh produce in moist sand. This kept carrots, beets, parsnips, turnips, and radishes crisp and sweet from October through April. The technique was specific. He pulled the roots in late autumn, just after the first frost had concentrated their sugars, but before the ground froze hard. He twisted off the leafy tops at the crown, leaving an inch of green stem. He did not wash them. He layered them in a wooden crate or a galvanized tub, alternating layers of roots with layers of slightly moist sand from a stream bank or a builder's pile. The sand kept the roots from touching each other and from drying out, and held just enough humidity to prevent shriveling. Stored in a cellar at 33 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, those carrots came out in March crisper and sweeter than the day they were pulled. Apples on the same shelves stored separately because of the ethylene gas they released. Onions hung in mesh bags, away from everything else. A modern refrigerator with a vegetable drawer holds maybe 2 weeks of carrots before they go limp. Your grandfather's sand crate held 6 months of them. The technique is older than the United States and has been forgotten in roughly 2 generations. Number 12, gel culture and the buried wood bed. In Eastern European peasant farming, going back to at least the 18th century, gardeners built raised beds with a foundation of buried logs, branches, and woody debris beneath the soil. The German word for it is Hagelkultur, literally hill culture. Your grandfather may have called it the wood pile garden if he learned it from a Polish or Hungarian neighbor. The technique looks unconventional and is: you dig a trench 2 feet deep, you fill it with whole logs, branches, and woody yard waste. You cover the wood with several inches of grass, clippings, leaves, and aged manure. You top the whole thing with 12 to 18 inches of soil and finished compost. You plant directly into the top layer. What happens beneath the surface is remarkable. The buried wood acts as a giant slow-release sponge. It absorbs water during rainy periods and releases it during droughts. It decomposes slowly over 15 to 20 years, releasing nutrients. Gradually, it builds a fungal network that connects to plant roots. A properly built Hagelkultur bed needs no additional fertilizer for the first decade and requires almost no irrigation after the first season. The yields from these beds in the 2nd through 10th year are dramatically higher than from conventional flat soil beds. The technique uses materials most homeowners pay to remove from their property. The system is genuinely set and forget at a scale and with a reliability that no commercial garden product can match. Number 11, the Great Extinction. Third, pattern break. In 1903, the United States Department of Agriculture conducted a comprehensive inventory of vegetable varieties available to American farmers. They counted approximately 7,500 distinct, named varieties of common food crops, from heirloom apples to lost squashes to regional corn types, bred over centuries by specific farming communities. In 1983, 80 years later, the same inventory was conducted by the Rural Advancement Foundation International. They found that approximately 93% of those varieties had gone completely extinct, not endangered, not commercially unavailable, extinct, gone forever from the genetic record of American agriculture. Apples that had been grown for a century in in the Shenandoah Valley were gone. Tomato varieties that had been bred for the climate of New England were gone. Corn varieties that had been developed by the Hopi and the Cherokee were gone, surviving only in the seed banks of the descendants of those nations. The cause was not technological. The cause was commercial concentration. As 4 or 5 large companies came to control American seed distribution, they consolidated around a small number of high-volume hybrid varieties that performed adequately in many regions and excellently in none. The thousands of locally adapted heirloom varieties that had defined American gardening for 2 centuries were quietly delisted from catalogs, lost from kitchen gardens, and forgotten by a generation that had stopped saving its own seeds. What your grandfather grew is largely no longer growable, not by you, not by anyone. The seed bank that survives is held by a handful of stubborn organizations and a few thousand families who never stopped saving. Number 10. Heirloom potatoes and the chitting method. Grocery store potatoes are sprayed with sprout inhibitors and grown from commercial seed potato stock that has been bred for transportation, not flavor. Your grandfather grew potatoes from saved seed potatoes of varieties that have names you have never heard: German butterball, Russian banana, purple Peruvian, Yukon gem, Corolla, Binjay. Each one had a specific use, a specific texture, and a specific season. The Russian banana made the best potato salad. The purple Peruvian held its color when fried. The German butterball mashed silkier than any commercial variety and stored longer in the cellar. The chitting technique he used in February was as old as potato cultivation in Europe. 6 weeks before the planting date, he laid his saved seed potatoes up in a single layer in egg cartons and placed them on a cool windowsill in indirect light. By planting time, each potato had grown short, stocky, dark green sprouts a half-inch long. Those pre-sprouted potatoes were planted directly into the garden in March, and they emerged from the soil 2 weeks earlier than unchitted potatoes, extending the harvest season by a month. A pound of seed potatoes of an heirloom variety from a specialty supplier costs about $7 and yields 10 to 15 pounds of harvest in good soil. The same pound of grocery store potatoes is treated to prevent sprouting, will not always produce viable plants, and represents a single industrial variety bred for shelf life rather than taste. The difference at the dinner table is profound and impossible to explain to anyone who has not eaten both. Number 9. The forgotten crops. Salsify, also called the oyster plant, was on the dinner table of every farmhouse from Pennsylvania to Iowa for 2 centuries. Steamed and dressed in butter, it has a faint mineral flavor reminiscent of shellfish that gave it its common name. Today, it is essentially absent from American grocery stores and unknown to most home gardeners under 50. Parsnips were a winter staple in colonial American kitchens for 200 years, sweetened by frost and roasted with butter. They were one of the most reliable cold-weather garden crops in the eastern United States. They are now considered a curiosity vegetable that most modern shoppers cannot identify on sight. Ground cherries, those papery, husked yellow fruits with a pineapple, strawberry flavor, grew wild in nearly every Midwestern garden until the 1950s. Your grandmother made ground cherry pie in August. Today, the plant survives mostly as a roadside weed in regions where it was once a beloved kitchen ingredient. Pawpaws, the largest native fruit of North America, were one of George Washington's favorite desserts. They taste like banana custard with notes of mango and have a buttery texture. Unlike any commercial fruit, they cannot be transported commercially because they bruise instantly and ferment within 3 days of ripening. Almost no American under 40 has ever eaten one. These crops were not abandoned because they were inferior. They were abandoned because they could not survive the global supply chain. Your grandfather grew them because his garden was his supply chain. The seeds and roots are still available from heritage suppliers. The varieties are still alive. They are simply no longer part of the American food story. Number 8. The deep tomato seed save. The fermentation method for tomato seeds is so simple, so reproducible, and so effective that it threatens an entire commercial industry. 2 of the largest seed companies in the world have spent decades suggesting in their educational materials that home seed saving produces inferior plants and that gardeners should buy fresh seed every year. The science says otherwise. Tomato seeds are coated in a gel-like substance inside the fruit that contains germination inhibitors. In nature, those inhibitors break down when the fruit decomposes on the ground over the winter. The fermentation method recreates that decomposition. In 3 days, on a kitchen windowsill, cut the ripest tomato, squeeze the seeds and gel into a small glass jar. Add an inch of water. Leave the jar uncovered for 3 days at room temperature. A layer of white mold will grow on the surface. The mold is doing the work of breaking down the inhibitor coating. On the 3rd day, pour the contents through a fine sieve. Rinse the seeds with cool water until they are clean and slippery. Spread them on a paper plate and dry them away from direct sun for 1 to 2 weeks. Stored in a labeled paper envelope in a sealed glass jar in a cool, dark place. Those seeds remain viable for 5 to 10 years. The germination rate of properly fermented heirloom tomato seeds frequently exceeds the germination rate of commercially produced seeds of the same age. Your grandfather did this every September. He never bought a tomato seed in his life. Number 7. Beans, peas, and corn. Beans and peas are the easiest seeds in the entire vegetable kingdom to save. They are self-pollinating, meaning the flower fertilizes itself before it even opens. Cross-pollination between varieties is rare. To save bean seeds, your grandfather simply let the last pods of the season dry on the vine until they rattled, then shelled the dry beans into a paper sack. Corn is the opposite. Corn is wind-pollinated and crosses promiscuously over distances of up to a mile. To save pure corn seed, your grandfather either grew only one variety or he timed his plantings so that his sweet corn flowered 3 weeks before his field corn, or he hand-tasseled and bagged ears the way commercial seed corn breeders still do today. He understood the genetics of his crops without ever having taken a biology class. The corn varieties he grew were named regional and specific: country, gentleman, Stowell's, evergreen, black, Aztec, golden, bantam. Each one had a flavor and a use. Each one carried a genetic story, going back generations of selection by specific farming families. When you save corn seed correctly, you are participating in that story. When you stop saving, the story ends. A packet of saved bean seed from the previous season produces enough plants for a family's entire bean supply for a year, with seeds left over to share with 3 neighbors. The cost is 0. The reliability is total. The variety is whatever your great-grandmother chose to grow. Number 6. The patenting of life. 4th pattern break. On the 16th of June, 1980, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the case of Diamond v. Chakrabarty that a living, genetically modified organism could be patented. It was a 5-4 decision. The majority opinion held that anything under the sun made by man could be patented, including life itself. That ruling opened the door to the patenting of genetically modified seeds. By the late 1990s, the agricultural giant Monsanto had developed a soybean engineered to survive the herbicide glyphosate, which the same company also sold. The seed and the chemical were sold together as a system. Farmers who bought the seeds signed contracts, agreeing not to save them, not to replant them, and not to share them. Violation of those contracts resulted in lawsuits. Monsanto, now part of Bayer, has filed dozens of lawsuits against American farmers for the alleged unauthorized planting of patented seeds. Some of those farmers had their fields contaminated by drift from neighboring patented crops. They were sued anyway. The principle established in 1980 has metastasized. Today, large portions of the American food supply are grown from patented seeds owned by a handful of corporations. The act of saving seeds, which was the bedrock of agriculture for 10,000 years, has been transformed into an act that requires legal sophistication and corporate permission. Your grandfather's seed envelope was a quiet rebellion against this transformation. Half a century before it happened, the envelopes are still being kept by people who understand what is being lost. The legal architecture of modern agriculture cannot reach into a personal garden. where saved heirloom seeds are being grown for personal use. That space, and only that space, remains free. Number 5. Liquid fertilizers from weeds and manure. Walk into any garden center in 2026, and you will find a wall of liquid fertilizers in plastic jugs, ranging from $12 to $40 per gallon, marketed with words like organic, premium, and concentrated. Your grandfather made the same products in a 5-gallon bucket from yard waste and animal byproducts. Comfrey tea was made by stuffing a bucket, 2/3 full of cut comfrey leaves, filling the rest with water and letting it ferment in the sun for 2 to 3 weeks. The result was a dark green liquid with a powerful smell, rich in potassium and nitrogen, that he diluted 10 parts water to 1 part tea and applied as a foliar spray on his tomatoes. Nettle tea worked the same way and was particularly rich in iron and magnesium. Manure tea required only a burlap sack of aged manure suspended in a barrel of water, steeped for a week, and diluted before application. Each of these liquid fertilizers cost, essentially, nothing and outperformed many commercial products in head-to-head trials at university agricultural extensions. The smell of these brews is the reason most modern gardeners buy commercial substitutes. The performance, especially on heavy feeding crops like tomatoes and squash, is at least equal to anything in a plastic jug. The hard part is getting past the smell. Your grandfather worked downwind of the bucket and considered the result worth a few minutes of stink. Number 4. Wood ash, coffee grounds, and eggshells. 3 of the most valuable soil amendments in the home garden are produced as waste by the average American kitchen and discarded into trash bags every week. Your grandfather collected all 3 and applied them to specific crops at specific times of year. Wood ash from a hardwood burning stove is a concentrated source of potassium and a powerful liming agent that raises soil pH. Sprinkled around tomatoes, peppers, and brassicas at planting time, it provides essential nutrients and discourages slugs. A coffee can of ash treats 100 square feet of garden bed. Coffee grounds are mildly acidic, rich in nitrogen, and improve soil structure. He saved his morning grounds in a tin and worked them into beds where blueberries, rhododendrons, and acid-loving crops grew. Coffee grounds also repel slugs and many soft-bodied garden pests when sprinkled directly on the soil surface. Eggshells, crushed and dried, deliver slow-release calcium directly to the root zone. He buried crushed shells beneath every tomato transplant to prevent blossom end rot, the calcium deficiency that ruins tomatoes mid-season for gardeners who do not amend their soil. The shells dissolve slowly over weeks and feed the plant exactly when it needs the calcium most. Together, these 3 free amendments replace soil products that would cost a serious gardener $100 a year. They are produced daily by every American kitchen. The vast majority go straight to landfill. Number 3. The kitchen scrap trench. If a full compost heap was beyond a household space or labor budget, your grandfather had a simpler version that worked nearly as well. The trench compost. Once a week, he dug a foot-deep trench along the edge of an unused garden bed, dumped the kitchen scraps directly in, and covered them with the soil he had removed. Within 2 months, the buried scraps had decomposed into rich, finished compost in place, exactly where the next crop would be planted. The technique is essentially set and forget composting. There is no pile to turn, no smell to manage, no rodents drawn to an open heap. The earthworms and soil microbes do all the work below ground. The microbiology of the trench works because the buried organic matter is in direct contact with the existing soil microbiome. The decomposition is anaerobic at depth and aerobic near the surface, producing a balanced, finished material that crops thrive in. It is the closest thing to free fertilizer that home gardening offers. A family of 4 produces approximately 3 pounds of compostable kitchen scraps per Dalton Y. Sent to a landfill, that material decomposes anaerobically and produces methane, a greenhouse gas with 28 times the warming potential of carbon dioxide. Buried in a garden trench, the same material builds soil and feeds tomatoes. The choice between the 2 outcomes is made every evening at the kitchen sink by tens of millions of households. most of which have never considered the alternative. Number 2. The Garden Journal and Phenology. On a high shelf in your grandfather's tool shed, there was a hardbound notebook with a black cover and a year written on the spine. He had a different one for each year, going back to 1958. Inside each notebook, in small, careful handwriting, were the dates of every event that mattered to a person who lived close to the soil. The dogwoods bloomed on the 14th of April. The peas went in the ground 3 days later. The black walnut tree leafed out on May 2nd, which meant the last frost was past and the tomato transplants could go in the following weekend. The first ripe tomato came on the 19th of July. The first hard frost on the 8th of October. The garlic cloves went in on the 30th of October. The cycle began again. This is called phenology, the study of recurring biological events tied to climate cues. Your grandfather did not know the word. He knew that when the dogwoods bloomed, the soil was warm enough for peas. He knew that when the lilacs leafed out, the corn could go in. He knew that when the geese flew south in V formation, the first frost was within a week. The signs were a calendar, more reliable than any printed almanac, because they were tuned to his specific piece of land. Modern agricultural extensions are now reconstructing this knowledge using satellite data and climate models, and they are publishing planting recommendations that match, almost word for word, what your grandfather wrote in his black notebook in 1962. The notebook still exists. Most of them, written by people now gone, are sitting in attics and garage sales across the country, waiting to be either kept or thrown away. Number 1. Knowing one piece of ground. The single most powerful skill on this list, the one that contains all 24 others, is something your grandfather developed over 40 years of paying attention to the same quarter acre of soil. He knew which corner of the garden held water after a heavy rain, and which corner dried first in August. He knew that the bed under the south wall warmed up 2 weeks earlier than the bed against the back fence, and he planted his earliest peas accordingly. He knew which tomato variety did well in the wet years and which did well in the dry. He knew that the wild sorrel growing on the south slope was a sign of acidic soil, and that the lamb's quarter on the east side meant the soil was rich in nitrogen. He developed this knowledge because he stayed 40 years on the same land, watching the same soil through the same seasons, building a database in his head that no agricultural extension service can replicate because it was specific to his ground. Modern American agriculture treats land as interchangeable. A corn farmer in Iowa applies the same fertilizer formula recommended by the same extension service as a corn farmer in Indiana, regardless of the specific composition of his particular field. The result is the soil collapse that has reduced Midwestern topsoil by half over the last century. The cure for this is not technology. The cure is local knowledge of one specific piece of land, accumulated over time and passed to the next generation. Every other skill on this list serves this one. The compost feeds this one piece of ground. The cover crops protect this one piece of ground. The saved seeds adapt to this one piece of ground over generations. The Garden Journal records this one piece of ground. Without this one piece of ground, paid attention to over decades. The rest of these skills are exercises in technique. With this one piece of ground, they become a relationship. Your grandfather did not garden. He participated in a piece of land. The land remembered him. The soil he built will outlive his great-grandchildren. The seeds he saved are still circulating among people who never met him. This is the deepest knowledge he ever carried, and it cannot be sold back to you in a plastic jug or a glossy catalog. It can only be earned on one piece of ground over a long period of time by paying attention. Try one of these this week. Just one. Pick up a packet of heirloom tomato seeds at a feed store, or order one from Baker Creek or Fedco or any of the dozen heritage suppliers still operating in this country. Save the seeds from a single tomato in September using the 3-day fermentation method and store them in a paper envelope marked with a variety name. Build a compost heap in a corner of your yard from scrap lumber and kitchen scraps. Mulch one garden bed with the leaves your neighbor put out in bags. Then, ask yourself whether your grandfather was being primitive or whether he knew something that we have spent half a century forgetting. Under the noise of advertising and the pressure of supply chains, tell me in the comments which one you remember from your own family. Tell me if your grandfather kept a garden journal in a notebook with a black cover, or saved tomato seeds in paper envelopes in a kitchen drawer, or had a compost heap in the back corner of the yard that smelled rich every August. That knowledge did not die with his generation. It went into the soil, and the soil is still there, waiting for someone to remember how to read it. It is time to start growing again.